So what is judgment? Judgment is the process through which people draw conclusions from the evidence they encounter. And there are two ways people do this. These two processes are called induction and deduction. So for induction, reasoning is when you make judgments based on seeking general claims from specific bits of evidence. So for induction, what you do is you collect the data and then you draw a general conclusion based on the data. Deduction is when you start out with the general claims and then you say what follows from that claim. Okay, so you start out with the conclusion or the general claim, and then you say, if this claim is true, then these things have to follow. So induction is more like bottom up, right? You collect the evidence and then you draw the conclusion. So you go from the small pieces of evidence to make a larger conclusion. Deduction is like top down. You start off with the claim and then you say, if this claim is true, then these specific pieces of information have to follow. Why do people sometimes draw accurate conclusions from their life experiences and sometimes they do not? Sometimes we say, I call into question your judgment, or you didn't make very accurate judgments. Well, the answer is a lot more difficult, and we're going to explore that in this module. Let's start out with some simple tasks in which I'm going to ask you to do certain things. When I give you a task, you can use two methods to perform the task. The first method is called an algorithm, and an algorithm is basically trying different combinations. And then the second method is a heuristic, and a heuristic is a shortcut. So it's kind of your go-to method, your rule of thumb. So let me give you an example. I have here some letters on the slide, and I want to ask you, what word do these letters spell out? Abnormal. Okay, great. So that is the correct answer. Abnormal is the correct answer. And you could have done this two ways. You could have used an algorithm, which means you try every specific combination until you come up with the word abnormal. Or you could use a heuristics. And heuristic is just a shortcut, an educated guess, and a satisfactory answer. So you kind of say, that looks like, I see ab, I can see norm, abnormal, right? Which one is faster? Using an algorithm or a heuristic? Heuristic is faster. So an algorithm will guarantee that you come up with the correct answer. Remember, an algorithm is you're going to take every letter and put it in the first column. Every letter put it in the second column until you come up with a word. That's very time consuming. Heuristic means you're going to try certain combinations that make sense to you. So these are your educated guess. So heuristics are a lot faster. And most of the time, it will come up with the correct answer, but not all of the time. But that's okay, because most of the time you get a satisfactory answer. Okay, so people tend to use heuristics rather than algorithms. Why? It simplifies the task and it allows one to come up with an answer relatively quickly. Again, it may not lead to the correct answer all the time, but most of the time it will lead to a satisfactory answer. Okay, so let me ask you another question. How long does it take you to drive or walk to your favorite restaurant or your best friend's house? 30 minutes, 5 minutes? Okay, so you can probably give me an estimate pretty quickly. And you do this by using what's called an attribute substitution. So for many judgments in your daily life, such as, how long it will take you to go somewhere, you don't have direct access to the frequency of information, right? So you don't have a detailed log of every time you commuted to your favorite restaurant or every time you went from your house to your best friend's house. But you proceed with your judgment with this frequency estimate. Most of the time it takes me 5 minutes. Most of the time it takes me 30 minutes, right? That's called an attribute substitution. The strategy of relying on an easily assessed information, so this estimate, to make a judgment so that you don't have to calculate every single time you went from your house to your favorite restaurant or from your house to your best friend's house. Again, we don't do these algorithms. So algorithms will be you having a log of every time you've gone there. You know exactly how many minutes, how many seconds it took you. And then you come up with an exact time estimate for me. You don't do that. Most of the time you use these heuristics, you kind of say, well, most of the time I get there in 5 minutes. Most of the time I get there in 30 minutes. So this table shows different types of attribute substitutions. You do not need to memorize the table. I'm not going to ask you to memorize anything from this table, but I just want to highlight that there are usually two heuristics that you oftentimes use, and it's illustrated in this table. It's called the availability heuristic and the representative heuristics. So the availability heuristic is how easily can you come up with cases, and that will allow you to make frequency judgments in the world. So if things come to your mind quickly, you are more likely to say they occur more often in the real world than things that come to mind less quickly. And then the representative heuristic is how much resemblance is there between categories of events. And that influences the probability of you making a judgment of a specific instance of a category. And we're going to go into availability and representative heuristics in more detail on the next couple of slides. Okay, so let's take a look at availability heuristic first. Availability heuristic is that you base your judgment based on the ease to which examples come to mind. And these examples then is your proxy for frequency. So if it comes to mind easily, you think it's more frequent. If it takes longer to come to mind, you think it's less frequent. So if I asked you, are there more red cars or yellow cars? What would be your answer? The red tends to be a common answer if I ask somebody in LA, are there more red cars than yellow cars? Simply because red is a more desirable color for a car than yellow. But if I ask somebody in New York where they rely on taxis a lot, what do you think they would say? Are there more red cars or yellow cars? Yellow. So the answer then is not based on you going out and counting how many red cars you've ever seen and how many yellow cars you've ever seen, right? It comes to, oh, I see a lot of red cars or I see a lot of yellow cars. So these judgments are based on availability, so how easily it comes to mind. And if you're in a situation where there are a lot of taxis, and you are probably more likely to come up with cases of yellow cars than red cars. But if you're more in this LA where people are driving their own cars, you're more likely to come up with red than yellow. Okay, so availability heuristic is typically accurate because events or objects that are frequently occurring are more likely to be available in memory. So availability can be used as an index for frequency. Okay, so let me ask you more questions. Okay, and I don't have a right or wrong answer. So this is just your judgment. So you tell me. Which is a more common pet among college students, dogs or cats? So your answer is probably dependent on not going out and counting or surveying every college student and asking whether they own a dog or cat, but probably is, do you own a dog or cat? Or how many people you know that are college students who own a dog or cat? Okay, this one I know the answer to. Are there more words in the dictionary that begin with the letter R, or more words with R in the third position? Third position? So that is the correct answer. People might say that there are more words that begin with R, is that it's easy to come up with examples with words that begin with R rather than words with an R in the third position, right? So I can say red, ready, really. Those are really easy to come to mind. Whereas an R in a third position, I have to think bird. That takes a lot longer, right? Are there more deaths caused by cancer or heart disease? What do you guys think? Heart disease is the correct answer, but when we ask this, people do give cancer a lot. And the reason why is that cancer is typically covered more in the media. You see a lot more coverage of cancer, so people tend to think that it's more common, but actually heart disease is more common. And to be fair, more recently, heart disease has been brought up in the media a lot too. So, but the general idea is we make these judgments based on how easily things come to mind. These are like everyday life examples. Of course, in this class, we performed a lot of experiments and looked at these phenomena more in the laboratory. So Tversky and Kahneman did a lot of studies on judgment and decision making. And Kahneman is the first psychologist that won a Nobel Prize in decision making and these heuristics. This work is used a lot. You'll see that as we go through the class, a lot of real world examples. And it's used a lot in the media and in advertising to get us to behave certain ways. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit about factors that influence people's judgments. But let's take a look at the availability heuristic in the lab and how it's manipulated. Okay, so in this study, participants were presented with a list of names that, of course, they were asked to do something with. And in this particular case, they were asked to judge whether the lists contained more names of men or more names of women. And these lists didn't have a lot of gender neutral names. So it was usually names that can be more associated with men or women's names. A key aspect of these lists that the participants were given is that the name of men and the women names were equal. So the answer should be they were the same. However, of course, there were some manipulations that were done. And in the first group, participants were given these lists, but the names of the men tend to be famous. So these are famous people or names that are associated with famous men. And then the second group, they were given names of famous women. So the women's name tend to be ones that people would have a lot of name recognition. If I ask you the question, were there more male names or more female names on these lists? Correct answer would be neither. They were equal. But you'll see here that this manipulation of famous names led to differences. What were the actual results of the study? Remember, group 1 had equal number of male and female names, but the names of the men were more famous, and they indicated that there were more men's names on the list. Group 2, again, equal number of male and female names, but they indicated that there were more women's names on the list because the women's names were more famous. Why do you think famous names influence people's memories? Because they're easier to recognize. When you're asked to recall, were there more names of men or more names of women, you kind of think, what names were you able to recall? So the famous names were the ones that you recognize more. They were more memorable, so you recall them more. And if you recall more of those names, you tend to make that as that attribute substitution for frequency. So you say that I was able to recall them more easily, they're more memorable, there must be more of them. Okay, so that's the availability heuristic. So availability influences our judgment, and people regularly overestimate frequencies of rare events. People's judgments, and then in this case for physicians, where they tend to overestimate the likelihood of a rare disease, they might pursue tests and perform procedures that are more consistent with a rare disease than a more common disease. Why is this the case? Well, rare disease means that it doesn't occur frequently. But usually you remember a rare disease if it's very impactful. So these rare events are likely to be well recorded in memory. And because they're more available in memory, when people see symptoms that kind of resemble this rare disease, they tend to go after the diagnosis of a rare disease rather than a more common one. And this can lead to misdiagnosis and mistreatment. In another study on the availability heuristic, participants were asked to recall past episodes in which they were remembered to being assertive. One group was asked to give 6 examples, and the other group was asked to give 12 examples. Which group do you think judged themselves to be more assertive? The group that were asked to give 6 examples or the group that was asked to give 12 examples? Well, it's easier to come up with 6 examples of being assertive than 12. So those who were asked to only give 6 examples, when asked to rate how assertive you think you are, they rated themselves as being more assertive than the group who was asked to give 12 examples, because it was harder for them to come up with 12 examples unless they were a pretty assertive person. So what then causes the availability biases? Well, first of all, it's familiarity. So you tend to overestimate items that are familiar to you. So things that come more easily to mind because they're familiar, you tend to overestimate their occurrence. Vivid items come to mind easily, and they also usually come to mind first, so you can overestimate their likelihood. Recency is how recently you've heard something. So things that were heard more recently are easily recalled and more easily remembered. So you tend to overestimate recent events as well. There are real life impacts of applying the availability heuristics. So when you ask questions about like where should federal funding go? Should it go to preventing deaths from motor vehicle accidents or stomach cancer, preventing death from homicides or diabetes? Sometimes these judgments are made with how easily or how frequently people think an event occurs, and that may or may not match with reality. It also shows influence of the medium. So a lot of people are more afraid of flying than driving, even though the likelihood of you getting an accident is higher with driving than flying. But you have these phobias because of these vivid recall of plane crashes from the media.